Welcome back to Education Matters. Did you correctly answer false? Even though it is true that the base salaries of most school positions, including teachers and principals, are funded by the state, local districts and county governments are funding a growing number of personnel, including more than 5,000 teaching positions and more than 800 principals and assistant principals across the state. Up next, we have two of my go-to guys when it comes to school finance. We have Kris Nordstrom. Kris is an education and finance policy consultant. He spent 9 years with the General Assembly's nonpartisan fiscal research division as the education budget guy for all members of the General. One of the guys, so we'll say that. And then we've got next to him is Dr. Eric Houck. Eric is an associate professor of educational leadership and policy at UNC Chapel Hill, and he literally teaches a class on school finance. So, and according to his op-ed in December in the News and Observer, he talks about school funding at cocktail parties. So,
only until they leave me alone.
Exactly. So we've got the right guys. All right. So look. There's a General Assembly task force on education finance reform. There's the Governor's Commission on Sound Basic Education. There's My Future North Carolina. There's an actual Leandro case going on. So sure seems like something is going to change in school funding in North Carolina in the next year or so. I guess my question, I'll ask you first, Kris. Sure. Does it need to change?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity for improving the way we fund public schools. And I think the main way to think about that is, probably something Eric and I both agree on. The two main things that any policymaker should be focusing on is the adequacy of the system. Is there enough money overall? Is the pie big enough? And then the equity of the system. So how do we divide that pie to make sure that the school districts with the greatest needs are getting the biggest slice of the pie?
Right. Now, there was this sort of, at least the task force itself kicked off with a report that was done by the Program Evaluation Division. We actually had one of the authors on this show to talk about it. Now, there were some questions about that report. I think you had some took some issue with it. I mean, it basically said the whole system was just broken. And I mean, is that I guess sort of where do you fall on that point?
Well, that report you mentioned didn't look at the question of how the system is performing in terms of adequacy or equity. And then it made a series of recommendations on changing the existing system that actually would have shifted money from poorer districts, slightly, there's not a huge shift, but from poorer districts to the slightly wealthier districts. So I do have some issues with that report. That said, there is great room for improvement. I think our funding at about, 42nd in the nation per student is a great indication
per pupil spending.
A great indication that we're behind in adequacy. Also, if you look at our funding effort, what we spend on schools in relation to our state's GDP, we rank incredibly low compared to other states, indicating that we're not trying hard enough to fund our public schools. And then if you look in terms of equity, we see every year that the school performance grades that come out, we see that school performance grades are very closely related to the free and reduced lunch rates of public schools, indicating that school performance is very closely tied to socioeconomic factors, and that the state isn't doing enough from a financing perspective to help school districts and schools overcome those poverty-related barriers.
Well, that's a great, that last point, Eric, that's kind of one of your issues with why we should go to a weighted student funding formula, or some sort of weighted funding formula. For our viewers, we've talked about this before. Sure. We have an allotment system today, basically, that funds schools based on how many positions they should get.
Yes.
You're advocating, and certainly part of what the report from the General Assembly that came out said, is that we need to move something that is more weighted. Explain that.
Sure. Well, first of all, just to reinforce Kris's point, any funding model that provides insufficient resources into school systems is not going to work. What I've been thinking about and talking about is moving to a system where you articulate specifically how much more you want to spend per disadvantaged pupil in a pupil funding model. Currently, if you took the disadvantaged funding supplement that the state provides along with the low wealth supplement, it looks like it's about a 10 or 11% premium over what a non-poor student would bring into a district. That's wholly insufficient and inadequate.
And I mean, that's just that's based on it just takes a lot more, I guess, wraparound services, additional supports for those children, right?
Exactly. If you think about the resources that benefit kids with higher educational needs, those resources cost money. And it can be a lower pupil-teacher ratio, it can be wraparound services. And estimates would range anywhere from, say, a 60% to 90% premium if you're looking at educating those kids. And if we're looking at 11%, we're far below the standard. The idea of moving to weighting would say, let's make those numbers explicit, right? So take them out of some other separate formula that sits on top of an allocation model and say, this is what the state's committed to in terms of addressing the needs of higher educational needy kids.
Now, Kris, one of the things that I've heard some folks who are expressed concern about the weighted student funding formula is that it's frankly a little bit of skepticism that it actually, that if you identify it per student, it actually could make it a lot easier for the General Assembly, which has been very focused on privatization and school choice, vouchers, that if you identify those numbers, it's very easy to then to just sort of send that money out to private operators. Is that something that you think is a valid fear?
Yeah, that is a concern. In addition to adequacy and equity, another factor you want to see in your school finance systems is some level of consistency. That school districts need to know before the school year starts how much money they have to work with for the year so they can do budgeting and deploy resources where they need to be.
We're dealing with that right now with the class size mandate, right?
Absolutely. So systems where you hear sometimes about the money following the child, or a backpack model where if a student leaves a school system midway through the year, that the school system's budgets would then be reduced on account of that student. That's not very helpful for the systems that serve those students, and in the end, I have not seen any evidence that they're necessarily helpful for the students themselves.
Right. Eric, let me ask you this. You're familiar with the public school forum study, the one that Lindsay talked about at the beginning.
Yes.
That big gap between the low wealth counties, I mean, is that something we need to address?
I think it is. I think most responsible school funding systems across the country take into account and build into their state level model that there's some level of local funding that needs to happen, sort of a buy-in model where the first 5% of your school funding needs to come from local sources before the state matches. And a lot of states also deploy a more state-of-the-art guaranteed funding model where if you're one of those districts in eastern North Carolina and you're spending your political capital to raise your tax rates, and you're asking your population to sacrifice more in terms of local property tax, that you see a subsidized return on that, right. And that money is actually worth more or spends more and can bring in more educational resources.
And that's a different model than sometimes you hear folks talk about don't Robin Hood, don't take from the so you're saying it's an incentive to give more money as opposed to sort of
Correct.
Punishing the counties that do.
Exactly. You incentivize effort rather than taking money away from districts, which is highly politically unpopular.
Right. So where do you come down, Kris, on the notion of weighted student funding formula? Are there other ways? I mean, can you weight by district? Can you? I mean, what do you think if you were in charge? What would you do?
Well, I'm fairly agnostic about the difference between a weighted student formula and our current allotment system. I think at the end of the day, when it comes to which model is more likely to deliver an adequate and equitable funding system, there's really not a huge difference between the two. I think, if you look at the states with less student funding than us, 10 out of the 11 have weighted student systems. So okay. There's no indication that a weighted student system does much to bring up your per student funding. And then also if you look, there's several measures of equity, but of the states, the 33 states with less equitable funding than us, 29 of them have weighted student formulas.
Right.
So at the end of the day, what I think is a lot more important than the model you choose is really the policy decisions made by the General Assembly and whether or not they will express, have the political will to deliver a system and deliver the funding necessary to the right districts.
Right. Last word from you, Eric. Do you agree?
Sure. I think the point that insufficient resources put into any kind of model is going to result in bad things for kids. I think that You know, when Kris and I are talking, I think a policy-first approach where you think about the people who are in power making these decisions is a really important component of reforming school funding in North Carolina. But I also think creating structures that are more or less immune to bad political actors is also important.
Right.
And
Excellent point. Good conversation. We'll have you back because there's going to be a lot of this going on. Probably won't happen in the next few weeks, right? So we're going to be over this for the next year. So thanks so much. After the break, this week's Leadership Spotlight.